Hello, dear participants. Thank you for subscribing to this important Security Intelligence and Forensics program with Nasford University, coordinated by Mr. Kusi Apia. And I'm your facilitator. My name is Alhaji Irbad Ibrahim. And we are going to take two courses. One is National Security and Terrorism, the emerging issues and trends. And then the second one is suspicious packages and bomb management. Just as we started via Zoom, terrorism as an international security phenomenon has long been recognized as a serious foreign and domestic security threat. So, for example, since 9/11, the United States of America has made terrorism its #1 national security priority. But apart from that, it has also become a domestic issue to many countries. For example, Ghana is investing heavily to protect our northern borders because Burkina Faso is reeling under the attacks of some of these militant organizations. So no country can say it is immune from this perennial security challenge that is called terrorism. So it is international in its outlook, judging from the response the world has given since 9/11, but it is domestic because it impacts the security of individual countries. This paper I'm presenting is a brief that will examine international terrorist actions and threats and the US policy in terms of response. And of course, Ghana is responding, but we've never been attacked by a terrorist organization. So it depends on how the US views how each nation in the world can respond to terrorism. As the 9/11 Commission report released on July 19, 2004 concluded, the United States needs to use all tools at its disposal, including diplomacy. So since 9/11, the US has responded in a varying degree or in varying degrees or extents to various threats. For example, in Afghanistan, the US didn't use only diplomacy. It used lethal force. It went there, fought against the Taliban government and dislodged Al-Qaeda. But diplomacy could also be used. So the first attempt to make in tackling terrorism is the use of diplomacy. So many of these groups are just fighting because of local grievances. For example, Al-Shabaab. You would want to say, okay, let's use diplomacy. What are the issues? Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, operating in Yemen, for example. What are the issues? Can we sit together and negotiate? Even the US, after almost 20 years of fighting in Afghanistan, has started talking to resolve issues diplomatically with the Taliban. And so the first step every country has to take when it is confronted with terrorism is use diplomacy. Number 2, international cooperation. No country can act like an island. And some of these groups have got multinational fighters. That is why in Ghana, a young man from KNUST, Alema, went to Syria to fight. He is not a Syrian, or he wasn't a Syrian. He was a Ghanaian. But because of the international outlook, international cooperation is important. So if the US wants to tackle the Syrian crisis, of course, Ghana should also be of interest because Ghana has had one of his own join some of the groups or one of the groups fighting in Syria. So international cooperation, diplomacy are key. And then there is constructive engagement. How can we engage to resolve the grievances of these groups so they don't continue to fight? Then in some cases, states may be sponsoring some of these groups. So where the international community finds out that country A or country B is giving money, logistics and weapons to a group, there could be international economic sanctions. So that we say, okay, if you are a petrol producing country or an oil producing country, the world will not buy petrol from you again. So that we can twist the arm of such a country to stop supporting such militant organizations. Then there is also the element of covert action. Covert action has to do with the use of secret operations abroad, and America has perfected that craft. It has unmanned drones around the world, so it does surveillance, reconnaissance, and then it tries to dissipate the sleeper cells of some of these groups around the world. Then there's also physical security enhancement. If you travel by air, before 9/11, if you got to an airport, an international airport, in your suit, you would have your suit on. You would just go through basic security checks. But since 9/11, physical security has been enhanced. That is why when you go to an international airport, people will just be roaming about. They will ask you to remove your jacket, remove your shoes, remove your belt, and all that. And the cockpit was accessible to the stewardesses on board a plane. But now a cockpit is sealed. Because what the world learned from the 9/11 attacks was that the militant groups or the militants had access to the cockpits, and then they captained the planes to whatever destinations they wanted, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and other places. And so Ghana as a country may want to enhance its security patrol along our border with Burkina Faso. So the Paga area, the Hamile, and those areas that are of interest. And then finally, the last resort is the use of military force. But the mistake the world has made in tackling terrorism since 9/11 is that this series of actions that can be taken to resolve have been turned upside down. So instead of looking at diplomacy, international cooperation, constructive engagement, economic sanctions, covert operations, physical security enhancement, and then military force would be the last resort, in some cases, military force has actually been used before even thinking of diplomacy. So a modern trend in terrorism is towards loosely organized, self-financed international networks of terrorists. So you find that these are groups that try to capture land. So in Syria, for example, you hear that Aleppo at some point was captured by militant organizations. Idlib was captured by militant organizations. Very close to us in Nigeria, the northeast, you heard that Borno State, Yobe State, and Adamawa State were all, they had towns and villages that were captured by these groups. And when these groups want to self-finance and they capture a territory, God forbid, if Kumasi is to be captured by a militant organization, how does it self-finance itself? How does it self-finance? It will take taxes or tolls from people. It will set up road blockades to take tolls from people. And where there are natural resources like oil, the militant organization would want to sell the oil on the black market to get money to finance itself. So these groups now act like international companies or conglomerates. So it is based in Afghanistan, for example. It has opened a branch in Yemen. It has opened a branch in southern Algeria. So it's just like KFC or McDonald's or any international organization with franchises around the world. Another trend is toward terrorism that is religiously or ideologically motivated. Many of these groups, before they attack, they utter Allahu Akbar. So there's a temptation to think that terrorism is a Muslim problem or terrorism is an Islamic issue. But of course, there are groups that are fighting and then they belong to other religions. In Uganda, Joseph Kony has got a group called the Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA. They are fighting, they are killing people, but they say they are fighting for the sake of Christ or Christianity. So they avert or professed intention of a group linking itself to a religion may not necessarily be the case. And the IRA was a Catholic group fighting in Northern Ireland and bombing places and all that. But then Catholicism or Christianity wouldn't accept killing innocent civilians. Islam doesn't accept killing innocent civilians. So the actors involved may be Christians, or the actors involved may be Muslims. The fact that you are a criminal and then you commit murder, for example, Kweku can commit murder, Muhammad can commit murder, Ibrahim can commit murder. But when the person commits murder, it is unfair to attach the person's religion or faith to that murder. So don't say this is a Muslim murderer, this is a Christian murderer. A murderer is a murderer. So if these groups happen to be Muslims and they are operating in Muslim countries, that doesn't mean it is the religion that encourages them to go about bombing places and people. So the world has been tempted to use words like radical Islam, Islamic fundamentalism. All of these complicate the kind of response the world can give. Let's take the religion away from the activities of these groups, because a crime is a crime regardless of who commits it. These fundamental groups or groups are using religion as a pretext, and they pose terrorist threats of varying kinds to the US interests and friendly regimes around the world. A third trend is the apparent growth of cross-national links among different organizations. So Al-Qaeda is there, then Al-Shabaab is there. Then Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda have got some operational, interests. They act together. Oh, now let's attack embassies. So while they are far away, they can decide that a chain of attacks will be targeted at embassies. Or let's attack 5-star hotels or 4-star hotels. Oh, let's attack areas where Westerners live. Let's attack restaurants that are patronized by Westerners. And so all of these are making these groups, all of these activities are making these groups act as cross-national rather than domesticated groups. And this may involve combinations of military training, funding, technological transfer, or political advice. So these are the new trends, and you'll find this in the handout that has been given to you. Looming over the entire issue of international terrorism is the specter of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. In Iraq, the US accused Saddam Hussein of possessing weapons of mass destruction, but later that invasion resulted in the deaths of so many people, but it came out that it was a lie. And so attaching states and accusing them of sponsoring groups and accusing them of the possession of certain weapons could also belie the ideal fundamentals we need to tackle this issue. So for instance, Iran is seen as the most active state sponsor of such groups. But Iran says no, it is not sponsoring such groups. And then a country like North Korea has got enriched uranium. If North Korea decides to support one of these groups, that will spell doom for international security. As a result, stakes in the war against international terrorism are increasing, and the margins for error in selecting appropriate policy instruments to prevent terrorist attacks are diminishing. US policy towards international terrorism contains a significant military component reflected in the war in Iraq, US operations in Afghanistan, deployment of US forces around the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa is where Somalia is. There's also Djibouti, the Philippines, and then ongoing operations in Colombia. So drug barons and drug cartels are also seen as terrorist organizations. So you go to Mexico, such groups are there. In Colombia, some of these groups are there. In Brazil, in Philippines. So these are all considered terrorist organizations. So going beyond religion, there are varied reasons why some of these militant organizations continue to fight. What are the most recent developments in the fight against terrorism or in the dynamics of terrorist organizations? At first, these groups would want to get their fighters from around the world. Oh, let's meet in Kabul, Afghanistan, or let's meet in Khartoum in Sudan, because Osama bin Laden, when he was, banished from Saudi Arabia, he settled in Sudan for some time before he moved to Afghanistan. So people were coming from around the world, and in Syria, we saw that a Ghanaian, at least one Ghanaian, if not many more, people traveled there to train. But the new trend is called lone wolf attacks. That is, don't risk it. If you try to travel across the Mediterranean to come to the Middle East, you may be in trouble. But stay where you are. But because of the use of the internet, you can watch videos of how to make a bomb, an IED, an improvised explosive device, or watch a video on how you can go to a shopping mall and then shoot people who are shopping. So you can find an individual. He has never been to the headquarters of Al-Qaeda. He has never met any ISIS person. But the person uses the internet. He is indoctrinated. And the person learns basic military capabilities to go out there and attack his own country as a lone wolf. So the person can be acting alone, but he has been inspired by the ideology of a militant organization. And this is more difficult to fight. Because for somebody whose passport has got the stamp of the customs or immigration of Afghanistan or Pakistan, then Ghana can say, okay, let's watch this person carefully. What did he go to Afghanistan to do? But this is the case, the person is living in Accra, or is living in Kumasi, or in Sunyani. The person uses the internet on a laptop like this, gets ideas, and goes out there to attack a soft target. Such a new trend in terrorism is very difficult to fight. So recently you've seen that somebody can move a car, and then in London, he will mow down people with a car. Or somebody can take a knife, go out on the street and continues to stab people, and then say that I'm doing this because I belong to this group, when in fact he has never seen Al-Qaeda, he has never traveled to where Al-Qaeda is, but he's a lone wolf that has been inspired from afar. The war on terrorism was quite a great deal of a mistake, because when the US was responding to 9/11, it could have easily targeted those who attacked it, but it declared global war on terror, and that gave Al-Qaeda some credibility, a global credibility. It's just like saying, oh, this is a local champion. If I want to tackle this local champion, I'll tackle you on your own turf, locally. But then you say, no, this adversary I'm fighting is an international group. So somebody will sit back there and say, oh, so Al-Qaeda is even international. And there are no nationality barriers. I don't have to be a citizen of Afghanistan to join the Taliban or to join Al-Qaeda. Or I'm a Ghanaian, I can join. So that mistake the US and the rest of the world made in its response, or in the world's response to 9/11, made Al-Qaeda look bigger than it actually was. So you'd find people who didn't have anything to do with Al-Qaeda, but because they had a local grievance, they say, okay, since this is an international group, we can say we are affiliates of that group, just to get what street credibility and recruit young men to join the group. So that was a fundamental mistake in the world's response to 9/11. And again, I also mentioned that considering the problem, an Islamic problem, was a huge mistake the world made. So you didn't have Muslim communities contribute willingly in the fight against terrorism in terms of ideology, or somebody who goes and preaches in a very dogmatic way, saying that Boko Haram, for example, Boko Haram said Western education is haram, and then they found a support system because the world had turned its back and then considered this an Islamic problem, not rather than looking at it as a criminal problem, and those who perpetrate such a crime should be tackled rather than the religion. So you find countries that are accused of supporting some of these groups: Libya, Sudan, North Korea, Cuba, Syria, Iran, and all that. And the classification of these countries sometimes could be unfair, because North Korea is not a capitalist state. Cuba is also a socialist state. But because some of these countries don't share in the ideals of the US, capitalism and democracy, they are labeled as supporters of terrorism, when in fact the evidence available could be very minimal. So US policy response creates a little bit of a dilemma because it's considered a wholesale response rather than localizing these, securitizing and localizing these targets as those who are targeted to decimate them. So it became a global thing, roping in everybody and then accusing nations like Iraq falsely and leading to invasions. And terrorist organizations thrive in failed or failing states. So anytime there is a foreign invasion in the country, there is no total control. The country loses its sovereignty. The central government does not control every part of the country. So you find these groups capitalize on that to organize and then recruit people. So when Gaddafi was the leader of Libya, you couldn't say that a militant organization was operating in Libya. But since the same white people, Western powers, invaded Libya and toppled Gaddafi, now there are so many militant organizations in Libya. So when a country is unstable, then we say that country is on its path to becoming a failed state. So it's a failing state. Or it becomes completely unstable, it's a failed state. So the central government doesn't have control. And who causes this? It's normally the Western powers who accuse nations of possessing weapons of mass destruction. So let's go and attack. Then so many of these groups proliferate. And then in Syria, the Bashar al-Assad regime has to be toppled. Then you take weapons and be supporting rebels. And those rebels eventually will turn into Frankensteins. And then they fight you. So US policy response towards terrorism has not been the best, leading to the proliferation of these groups around the world in failed and failing states. So in a nutshell, and tomorrow, God willing, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions when we do this via Zoom. So with national security and terrorism, with the emerging trends, we have to look at the drivers of terrorism. What gives people the motivation to join such groups? One of them is economic inducement. Many of the young people that are recruited into such groups come from very poor backgrounds. And we are told that because these militant organizations get funding, they sometimes pay more than a regular army. So if you can be a Ghanaian police officer or a soldier, and they can give you 2 times or 3 times what your nation gives you to fight, of course, that economic inducement pushes some people to join the groups. Number 2, unresolved religious issues like the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So every day people watch on TV, Israel is attacking Palestinians. Palestinian women cannot, go to hospital freely to give birth. Palestinian children are being killed. So if there are such injustices being committed anywhere in the world, people can easily find a common denominator in terms of sympathy and empathy. So somebody is in Ghana, he's told that, Israel is attacking Palestinians, so let's go and attack Israel. When Ghana has not been attacked. So injustices around the world create an empathetic, motivation for people who feel touched and to want to go to these theaters of war to sacrifice themselves. And again, there's also the religious reason. Some say, okay, let's bring back the caliphate, let's establish Sharia law. And the only way we can do that is to make sure we fight America first. When America is defeated, it is the only stumbling block. It has to be removed before there's Sharia law. So you find people go out there to fight. And some also fight just because they are marginalized. And Ghana has to be quite careful, even though Ghana has never suffered a terrorist attack. But we see the yawning gap, the disparity between the north and the south. And then recently, a certain part of the country feeling that there's a voter registration ongoing and soldiers have been deployed heavily to intimidate us. So some of these forms of marginalism, whether real or perceived, could be the fundamental basis for people to be recruited into some of them. Maybe the person thinks, oh, I belong to this ethnic group and we are marginalized. Or I belong to this race of people. Or we are Arabs, and wherever Arabs are, America continues to bomb them. So we have to go and join the group and fight against America. Or we are black people. Black lives matter. Wherever black people are, despite many centuries of slavery, we are still being persecuted. Somebody may feel the need, because the person has a sense of belongingness, because of a shared identity. That identity could be ethnic, it could be racial, or it could be religious. So people may be enticed to join some of these militant organizations. So how does the world respond to terrorism? There should be reforms. And those reforms should impact the way the world tackles this issue. There should be community level engagement. How do we engage civil society organizations, the clergy, religious people? How do we find out what kind of preaching is being done in mosques? What kind of preaching is being done in churches? And churches gradually are creating a serious potential, security challenge. Because if a pastor or an imam can tell you, bring your passport to the church, or a pastor can tell people, bring your passport to your church or bring your underwear and I'll do this and this will happen. What shows that if the person says, take an AK-47 and go and shoot somebody? So these are areas of concern. Religious dogmatism, extremist preaching. Ghana and other nations should be able to look at that. And then chiefs have a role to play. Youth groups, opinion leaders will all need to be engaged so that the world can tackle the issue of terrorism. And marginalization should be tackled. Where people don't have amenities, they don't have basic facilities of life, good healthcare delivery, good education, good toilet facilities, they can easily be lured into fighting against the state and they will turn into militants or terrorists. So we should try our best to narrow the yawning gap between the rich and the poor so that we can tackle terrorism. And the use of social media for recruitment. Ghana should have a policy. Other nations should have a policy where any account on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube encourages people to fight against the state. We need to tackle the kind of content that is being streamed on various social media platforms, so people don't sell terrorist ideas to young, impressionable people. I hope this helps, and I'll be willing to take your questions. Thank you so much for participating in this episode of Knatsford's Security, Intelligence and Forensics class. I have been your facilitator, Alhaji Ibrahim. I'm willing to take your questions now.